2009 marks 50 years since the democratic reform in Tibet. In accordance with the decision by the Tibetan People's Congress, March the 28th will be observed as Serfs' Emancipation Day, when over 1 million Tibetan serfs were given their freedom. In recent years, the authorities in the U.S. have established in the state of Virginia the first museum recording the country's history of slavery. The French government has declared May the 10th as the day for remembering the abolition of slavery. In the English city of Liverpool, which was a major port used by slave traders, activities were held in 2007 to mark the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade. The era of slavery was one of the darkest periods in human history. People were deprived of their basic human rights, natural human decency was destroyed, and human culture and thought were shackled. The origins of the infamous slave trade can be traced back to the 15th century and the European colonists' overseas explorations. Thousands upon thousands of black people were kidnapped from Africa and sold in foreign countries, an action that has marked so-called Western civilization with the indelible stain of disgrace. For several centuries previously, a different system known as serfdom had been practiced on the European continent. It came into existence when, following the fall of the Roman Empire and the collapse of its system of slavery, vast areas of land were acquired by religious orders and secular nobles. The farmers who lost their land had only one choice if they were to survive: to accept being reduced to the status of property owned by the feudal landlords. They were forced to plow the fields belonging to the landlords. In return, they were subjected to oppression and exploitation. The system of feudal serfdom was also practiced in Tibet in China. There, however, it survived for much longer than it did in Europe. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, Western explorers and colonists in large numbers began crossing the snow-capped mountains and reaching Lhasa. Among them was a Briton named Charles Bell. Bell kept a diary, and in it he wrote that what he saw in Tibet gave him the feelings of returning to the Middle Ages. Tibet was still a feudal society where fire and boiling oil were common means of punishment, and sorcery was commonly practiced. The nobles and lamas had enormous power over their serfs, who themselves had almost nothing. In short, Bell said, every saw there reminded him of the brutality and savagery of Europe in the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages in Europe, a strict relationship of ownership existed between the landlords and the serfs. The king, the nobles, and the bishops formed the ruling feudal class. They forced the serfs to work in their fields, and in return allotted them a small plot of land to till for themselves. However, the purpose of giving the serfs land was not to allow them the chance to lead a decent life. It was in fact to ensure that the serfs were physically strong enough to work for their owners.
欧洲人在评价这个欧洲农奴制的时候，用这样话叫 only his belly， 这意思就是什么是农奴他自己的呢？只有他的肚子是他自己的，就是他的财产只有他的胃。
A similar expression was used far off in the East. In Tibet, it was said that the only thing a serf could take with him was his own shadow. All he left behind him was his own footprints. Like their counterparts in Europe, Tibet's landlords obtained their land in the form of feudal grounds. From the 14th century onwards, most of Tibet's territory, the pasture, forests, mountains and rivers, as well as the livestock, was owned by government officials, nobles and senior lamas. They were the three pillars of rule in Tibet, despite accounting for just 5% of the population. As for the remaining 95% of the population, they were serfs. There was little difference among the serfs in terms of their economic situation and degree of freedom. As the Tibetan folk song says, "Mountain there are beasts, not one of them with an owner. But at the mountain's foot there are serfs, not one of them without an owner." Lalu's farm lies just outside Lhasa. Here everything, as far as the eye can reach, used to belong to a landowner called Lalu. But while the crops in his fields were thriving, the fields belonging to his serfs were covered with weeds. The serfs had no time to tend them because they were spending all day working in the owner's fields. Dui-chung Kesang and her family had one wish. It was to have a roof over their heads. She had 2 children to raise and eked out a living by collecting cow dung and flaking tobacco. In Tibet, as in the West, the serfs could only survive by spending every spare moment doing extra jobs.
西藏主要以劳役地主为主，劳役地主的前提就是要对人身进行更严酷的限制，因为他劳役他不是交东西，首先要把人控制住，说这种对人身的控制就类似于奴隶，这是而且西藏的劳役农奴的劳役成分看样子是要比欧洲劳役地主时期更为严酷。
In Western Europe, the serfs, having been deprived of their basic freedom as human beings, were subjected to numerous forms of taxation: marriage tax, inheritance tax, poor tax, and so on. By comparison, the taxes Tibet serfs were forced to pay were far more numerous. There was a net tax for those who raised chickens, which was payable even on roosters. A family that hired a donkey to help with the plowing had to pay tax on the donkey.
一个牛，你比如说它3年清场一次，5年清场一次，你有10头牛，那么你每年就按10头牛，每头牛多少所有多少来杂，你年年得交。6年以后，你这个牛死光了，你还得交10头牛，哎，所以它叫不生不死。 你死光了，你还得交。
Li Guozhu entered Tibet not long after the peaceful liberation. She witnessed how one farm's housekeeper controlled the women serfs who wove the pulu fabric that is used in making traditional Tibetan clothing.
他在干活织铺路的时候，不让这个小孩哭了，不让去喂奶。 也不让你随便起来说是要去小便了，他们怎么办？就把他们那个裙子，是藏族同志穿的那个裙子上面，用土灰撒上，再用盖章贴纸用盖上章。你要是一起来喂奶，给小孩喂奶，你起来随便上厕所，你一起来那灰不就掉了吗？那个印不就没有了吗？那不行，就得挨打。
The right of owners to exploit their serfs physically was a feature of the systems of serfdom in both East and West. In feudal Europe, landowners had the right to take the virginity of all middle and lower class females. In Tibet, however, the practice was degrading and brutal.
西藏的奴主，他拥有比这个更大的权利，就是他只要看到年轻漂亮的 女农奴，他就可以指定她作为他的性奴隶，就可以长期的让她在自己的身边，啊，我觉得从这个意义上来说，这个西藏的农奴制度啊，应当说比中世纪的农奴制度啊更残酷。